The whiskey glass never trembled in Dean Martin's hand, not when Frank Sinatra threw chairs across Vegas dressing rooms, not when mob bosses made threats in smoky back rooms, not even when the phone call came that March morning in 1987, telling him his son Dean Paul was dead, scattered across a California mountainside in twisted metal and flame. But on a humid August night in 1973, in the basement office of the Cotton Club in Harlem, when Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson leaned back in his leather chair and said what he said about that boy, Dean's hand went still. Completely, dangerously still. And every man in that room knew they were witnessing something that would either end in blood or legend. The Cotton Club, in 1973, wasn't the glittering palace of the 1930s. It was something darker, more intimate, more dangerous. The basement office where Bumpy Johnson conducted his real business was a shrine to power wrapped in shadows. Mahogany panels lined the walls, absorbing secrets like sponges. A single lamp cast amber light across the green felt of a card table that had seen more money change hands than most banks. The air was thick with Cuban cigar smoke and the metallic scent of unspoken violence. This was where Harlem's king held court, where favors were negotiated and debts collected. And tonight, it was where Dean Martin found himself for reasons that had everything to do with respect and nothing to do with entertainment. Dean hadn't wanted to come to Harlem. He'd been in New York for 3 nights, headlining at the Plaza Hotel's Persian Room, when the message came through his manager. Bumpy Johnson wanted to meet, not a request, not an invitation, a summons. In the complex ecosystem of American power in 1973, there were hierarchies even the entertainment elite couldn't ignore. Bumpy Johnson controlled more than Harlem's streets. He controlled its cultural heartbeat, its underground economy, its unwritten laws. When Bumpy wanted to see you, you came, or you explained to very dangerous people why you hadn't. The meeting had been set for midnight. Dean arrived alone, against the protests of his security. He wore a charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored, his silver hair immaculate despite the August humidity. He looked like what he was, a man who belonged in different rooms, cleaner rooms, rooms where violence was theatrical rather than real. But Dean Martin understood power, and he understood that showing fear in this basement would be a mistake that followed him for the rest of his career. Bumpy Johnson was 66 years old in 1973. A legend carved from Harlem concrete and sharpened by 40 years of survival. He sat behind an enormous desk like an emperor on a throne, his dark suit expensive, his gold cufflinks catching the lamplight. Bumpy was smaller than his reputation suggested, but power didn't require size when it came from intelligence, ruthlessness, and the kind of respect that couldn't be bought or faked. His eyes were the color of old whiskey, and they studied Dean with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "Mr. Martin," Bumpy's voice was silk over steel, "good of you to come downtown. I hope your accommodations uptown are satisfactory."
"They're fine, Mr. Johnson. Thank you for asking."
Dean's voice carried its usual casual confidence, but his posture was respectful. He understood the game being played. "Please, sit." Bumpy gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Can I offer you a drink? I have some excellent bourbon, Kentucky's finest." Dean sat, keeping his movements controlled, deliberate. "I don't drink during business meetings." Bumpy smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. "Smart man, I respect that. Shows discipline." He leaned forward slightly. "I called you here because I wanted to meet the famous Dean Martin, the king of cool himself. You know, I've been in this business a long time, Mr. Martin. I understand entertainment value." The conversation felt like a chess match played in a foreign language. Every word carried multiple meanings, every pause a potential trap. Dean waited, knowing that whatever Bumpy wanted, it would eventually surface. "You've had quite a career," Bumpy continued, pouring himself a glass of bourbon from a crystal decanter. "Movies, records, television, the whole package. Very impressive for a boy from Ohio." He took a sip, savoring both the whiskey and the moment. Of course, success comes with a price, doesn't it? Fame has its costs. Dean felt the first whisper of unease. This wasn't heading toward a business proposition. This felt personal. "I heard about your boy," Bumpy said, his tone shifting to something that might have been sympathy if it weren't for the calculation in his eyes. Dean Paul. Terrible tragedy. A man losing his son. That's the worst kind of pain. He paused, letting the words settle. 35 years old, wasn't he? Prime of his life. Dean's jaw tightened imperceptibly. His son's death was still a fresh wound, the kind that bled every time it was touched. Dean Paul Martin had died just 6 months earlier in an F-4 Phantom crash during a California Air National Guard training mission. He'd been a pilot, a tennis professional, an actor, everything Dean had hoped a son could be. The funeral had been a media circus that Dean endured with his characteristic stoicism, but the grief lived in him like a cancer. Yes, Dean said quietly, it was. Bumpy nodded gravely. Military service, honorable thing. Though I always wondered about men who choose to fly those machines. Takes a particular kind of recklessness, wouldn't you say? The word hung in the air like a challenge. Flying jets, pushing limits. Some might call it brave, others might call it foolish. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dean's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very cold, very still. Some men, Bumpy continued, swirling his bourbon, they chase thrills because they can't handle the ordinary world. They need the adrenaline, the danger. Maybe they're running from something. Maybe they're trying to prove something to their fathers. He looked directly at Dean. Sometimes I wonder if boys like that, if they're really cut out for the family business. You know, the safe path, the smart path. Dean set his untouched water glass on the table with surgical precision. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but it carried a weight that made the air itself feel dangerous. Mr. Johnson, Dean said, I'm going to give you exactly 30 seconds to explain what you just said about my son. Bumpy's eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't expected this reaction. Most men, faced with Bumpy Johnson's displeasure, either cowered or exploded into useless rage. Dean had done neither. He'd gone cold, and cold was more dangerous than hot. I'm simply observing, Bumpy said carefully, that some young men make choices that put them in harm's way unnecessarily. Your boy, flying those military jets when he could have stayed safe in Hollywood, making movies, using his family name. Some might say he was running from something easier. Some might say, Dean replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that you're talking about things you don't understand. He leaned forward slightly. Let me help you understand. My son didn't run from anything. He served his country because he believed in something bigger than himself, something bigger than money, bigger than power, bigger than whatever it is you think you represent in this basement. The room had gone completely silent, except for the distant thrum of music from the club upstairs. Bumpy's associates, who had been quietly stationed around the room, shifted uncomfortably. They could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. Furthermore, Dean continued, his voice still deadly quiet, if you ever speak about my son again, if you ever question his courage, his character, or his choices, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that every entertainer, every record executive, every club owner from here to Los Angeles knows exactly what kind of man Bumpy Johnson really is. He paused. I'll tell them how the great Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, gets his kicks by mocking dead children to their grieving fathers. Bumpy's face had gone stone. In 40 years of wielding power, very few men had spoken to him this way. Those who had generally didn't live to regret it. But this was Dean Martin, and killing Dean Martin would bring heat that even Bumpy couldn't handle. More importantly, something in Dean's eyes suggested that death might not intimidate him the way it intimidated other men. You see, Dean continued, I don't care about your reputation. I don't care about your territory. I don't care about whatever arrangements you have with other people in my business. What I care about is my son's memory. And if you think I won't burn every bridge, end every friendship, and destroy every business relationship I have to protect that memory, you don't understand who you're dealing with. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes. Bumpy Johnson, for the first time in recent memory, found himself genuinely unsure of how to proceed. He'd intended to test Dean Martin, to probe for weakness, to establish dominance. Instead, he'd stepped on a landmine. Finally, Bumpy spoke. Mr. Martin, he said, his voice much more careful now, I think there may have been a misunderstanding. No, Dean said flatly, there wasn't. You meant exactly what you said. The question is whether you're man enough to apologize for it." Another long silence. Bumpy Johnson didn't apologize. It wasn't in his nature, wasn't part of his brand. Apologies were admissions of weakness, and weakness was death in his world. But something about Dean Martin's stillness, his complete absence of fear, made Bumpy reconsider the mathematics of power. "Your son," Bumpy said finally, "served his country with honor. That deserves respect." He paused. "I was wrong to suggest otherwise." Dean studied Bumpy's face for a long moment. It wasn't a full apology, but it was something, an acknowledgement, a retreat. "Thank you," Dean said simply. He stood up. "I think our business here is concluded. Sit down, Mr. Martin." Bumpy's voice carried command, but less edge than before. "We're not finished." Dean remained standing. "Yes, we are. I said sit down." Dean looked at Bumpy Johnson with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Johnson, you just learned something important about me. Don't make me teach you something else." For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the desk. Then, unexpectedly, Bumpy Johnson smiled. It was a genuine expression, the first real emotion he'd shown all evening. "Sit down," Bumpy said again, but this time it was a request, not a command. "Please." Dean considered for a moment, then sat. "You know what I like about you, Mr. Martin?" Bumpy poured himself another bourbon. "You've got backbone. Real backbone, not the fake kind most of your Hollywood friends carry around. When you stood up for your boy just now, that was real. That was a father talking, not a celebrity. Every word I said, I meant. I believe you, and I respect it." Bumpy raised his glass. "To Dean Paul Martin, a man who served his country." Dean picked up his water glass and raised it slightly. They didn't toast, exactly, but they acknowledged each other. "You want to know why I really asked you here?" Bumpy set down his glass. "Because I wanted to see if the stories were true. If Dean Martin was really as unshakable as they say. If you were the real deal, or just another pretty face with good press." He smiled again. "You're the real deal." Dean said nothing, waiting. "I have grandchildren," Bumpy continued. "Boys who look up to men like you, men who seem to have it all figured out. I wanted to see if you were worth their admiration." He leaned back in his chair. "You are." "Mr. Johnson," Dean said, "if you have grandchildren, you know that a man's children are his legacy. They're the only thing that really matters when everything else is stripped away. My son is gone, but his memory isn't, and I'll protect that memory with everything I have." "I understand that now," Bumpy said quietly, "and I respect it." Dean stood again, and this time Bumpy didn't stop him. "I should get back uptown." "Of course." Bumpy rose as well. "Mr. Martin, what happened here tonight, what I said about your son, that was out of line. I'm genuinely sorry for your loss." It was a real apology, finally, full and unqualified. "Thank you," Dean said. "That means something." As Dean reached the door, Bumpy called out, "Mr. Martin." Dean turned. "If you ever need anything in this city, anything at all, you call me. That's not a business arrangement. That's personal respect." Dean nodded once and left. The story of that night in Bumpy Johnson's office spread through certain circles like wildfire. Not the entertainment press, not the gossip columns, but the underground networks where real power was discussed and analyzed. The word was that Dean Martin had faced down Bumpy Johnson and walked away with respect intact. More importantly, he'd done it without raising his voice, without making threats he couldn't keep, without backing down from a man who could have destroyed him. Bumpy Johnson died 2 years later, in 1975, of a heart attack in Wells Restaurant in Harlem. At his funeral, among the flowers and mourners, there was a simple arrangement with a card that read, "For a man who understood respect, Ms. DM." Dean Martin never spoke publicly about that night in the Cotton Club basement. When asked about his relationship with Bumpy Johnson, he would simply say, "We understood each other." But those who knew Dean said that something changed in him after that meeting. He became even more protective of his family's privacy, even more careful about the legacy he was building. He'd learned that even in the sophisticated world of entertainment, there were still places where primal truths mattered more than fame or money. The lesson of that August night wasn't about courage, though courage was certainly involved. It was about the mathematics of respect. Dean Martin had shown Bumpy Johnson that some things couldn't be bought, intimidated, or manipulated. A father's love for his son, the protection of family honor, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the things that really mattered. In the end, both men understood that power without honor was just violence, and violence without purpose was just destruction. They were both fathers, both men who had built something from nothing, both survivors in worlds that didn't forgive weakness. And in that basement office in Harlem, surrounded by shadows and secrets, they had found a common language that transcended race, culture, and the artificial boundaries of their different worlds. The language of respect.